Hello again everybody, and today I'm going to talk about another place in Rome which is not that well known but is pretty important, particularly for Christians but also for those interested in Roman history. This is the so-called Mamertine Prison, once called the Tullianum, and it's one of the gloomiest places you can possibly visit in Rome. Indeed, pretty much anywhere I can think. You can't do much worse than this for gloominess. Sited beneath a church, just beyond the limits of the Forum Romanum, just behind the Arch of Septimius Severus, is this prison. The proper name for that in Latin is carcere, as in the word incarcerate. It was once called the Tullianum. It might have been named after Servius Tullius, under whom it was first built. In the early days of the Roman Republic. It might be related to the word Tullius, which refers to a spring. Anyway, it acquired the name Mamertine in the Middle Ages, and in truth, nobody really knows why that is. Now, although it's a prison, in no sense does this compare with a prison as a prison is used now. It's not a place where you deprive somebody of their liberty for a long period of time. For a Roman, a prison was somewhere where you kept somebody before they were going to be executed. It was to stop them running away, and you certainly weren't going to be paying for their upkeep while they were in prison. The Romans would have considered that a very bizarre idea indeed. If you once you've been found guilty under Roman law for serious crimes, you could be executed, or you could be severely beaten, or you could be sent into exile, or you could be sold into slavery. But you're not going to be kept in a prison for any length of time. How you were executed varied according to what legal status you had. For instance, you could be crucified if you weren't a Roman citizen, but you couldn't be crucified or indeed flogged in public if you were a Roman citizen, as St. Paul claimed immunity from flogging when he was first arrested. So this grim place then was a holding place for those who were going to be executed. There were some very famous prisoners of war who spent time in the Mamertine prison. Jugurtha, a North African king who fought successfully against Rome in the 1st century BC, a long war described by the great historian Sallust. He finished up in the Mamertine prison before he was executed. Vercingetorix, the scourge of Caesar, who made his life very difficult in Gaul for quite a long time, he was imprisoned here prior to being executed. Sejanus, the praetorian prefect of Tiberius, his great fixer until he fell out with his tyrannical master for getting ideas too big for his boots, wanting to marry the emperor's daughter. Wasn't too good if you were a common soldier. He finished up here prior to him being executed. Memorably portrayed that scene, by the way, in I Claudius, for those of you who with longer memories, or those with access to a DVD. But perhaps the two most famous people who may well have been held in the Mamertine prison prior to execution were Saints Peter and Paul. Now, I've mentioned this before in the talk about the Great Fire of Rome, but in 64 AD, under the Emperor Nero, a large part of Rome burnt down. Nero then blamed the incipient Christian church, and as part of that persecution of Christians launched by him in Rome, St. Paul, who was at that point already under house arrest in Rome, was almost certainly put into prison, and the Mamertine prison is likely to be it. He actually refers to his imprisonment in a letter to Timothy. The very earliest tradition also puts St. Peter as another person who was imprisoned and executed at this point. But their fates were very different because they had a very different legal status. So traitors could be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock. Prisoners of war and opponents of Rome were quite often strangled publicly. Some people were beheaded, as indeed happened to one of the two apostles. So there's decent evidence that St. Paul spent time there. He was almost certainly taken out of the city and executed by beheading just south of the city, on the place where St Paul outside the walls, San Paolo fuori le mura, now stands. Now that basilica was destroyed by fire in the 19th century and rebuilt, which is why it looks, partly why it looks so splendid today. But that's what happened to St Paul, and that's where he finished up. St Peter, on the other hand, was taken to the Vatican Hill and crucified, but crucified upside down. And the tradition is that he suffered that fate because he said he was not worthy to suffer the same fate as his saviour. So the Romans said, we can fix that, and they crucified him upside down. And this is represented on the small altar in the Mamertine Prison by the inverted cross, which you can see in this picture. So when you get to the Mamertine Prison, you descend from street level down to the first chamber, the sort of trapezium-shaped chamber. There's some medieval frescoes on the wall there, depicting saints and Paul and Peter preaching. And from there, and there's also a big sign on the wall telling you who was imprisoned there and how they died. I shall always remember the first time I saw the Italian word strangolati. So that's what happened to some people there. But you go, then you see in the floor there's a circular hole with a cover over it, and that is the hole down which prisoners were dropped before they were taken out for execution. They were just chucked in a dark hole underground. Nowadays you don't get there by dropping through the hole. There's a staircase that takes you down to this most grim and gloomy of places. It's dark, it's damp, and it's miserable. When you stand there, it's quite awesome to think of the people who have stood there before you. And if you're a Christian, to think that your feet are treading the same place, in the same room as Saints Peter and Paul, that's really quite an awesome experience. As we face challenges nowadays, it also causes one to think about the people around the world who face persecution, particularly Christians who are persecuted in many countries at the moment, but others too who are persecuted for their faith. And it makes one think about these apostles and how they faced their fate. And it makes me wonder whether, under the same challenge, whether I would have the same courage that they seem to have shown in meeting the fate that they met in 64-65 AD.